Hey, what's up, everybody? Thank you for joining. My name is Adam Vaughney, and I'm one of the founders of Jar Kombucha. Jar is a kombucha brewery that I co-founded in Hackney in East London in 2015. Thank you to the Leaf Envy team for letting me take over their Instagram live tonight. I'm going to do a 30-minute kombucha brewing workshop where I'm going to talk through the history, the science, the health benefits, and a quick tutorial on how to make your own kombucha at home. So just a quick one. This is our bottle. You may have seen it around in Leaf Envy. Also started in Hackney, so we're neighbors and friends. So thank you to them for having me. So let's get started. I'll start talking about the history of kombucha, and it dates all the way back to 221 BC in ancient China during the Qin dynasty. Now, people believe that kombucha was probably first brewed by accident. You know what I just realized is that I didn't actually tell you what kombucha is for those of you who are just hearing the word for the first time. Kombucha is fermented tea. It's made with tea, water, sugar, and a SCOBY. And a SCOBY is an acronym for a symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast. And we have all of these ingredients right in front of me now, and I'm going to teach you this brewing process. So let's jump back into the history. So kombucha was most likely brewed by accident, probably somewhere in a Chinese village, and somebody had probably taken a pot of tea and they'd sweetened it with something like raw honey, which was the only available source of sugar available about 2,000 years ago. And what happened was wild bacteria and yeast sort of swept through this village or this house, and it coated this pot of tea sweetened with honey in a layer of mold, which was essentially the world's first SCOBY. Again, that's the acronym for the symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast. And what happened was there was an interaction between that yeast and the sugar or the fructose from the honey, and it created this acidity. So the world's very first kombucha was made most likely by accident. And somebody was desperate or maybe even brave enough to drink this. And they either liked it or it made them feel good, so they started propagating this culture over time. And kombucha became this revered drink in ancient China. It actually has the nickname the tea of immortality. And it was used by royals, it was used in secret circles, it was sort of this magical elixir that was said to cure all. And that's sort of its origins and sort of this, mysticism that it still carries to this day. Now, kombucha eventually worked its way across Asia into various parts. It worked its way to Japan. In around 414 AD, the name kombucha came to be, at least according to myth. It said that the Japanese emperor at the time, his name was Inyakoto, was suffering from some kind of stomach ailment. And he hailed to his court this famous Korean physician named Dr. Kombu. I know it sounds ridiculous. And this Korean doctor arrived and he presented the emperor with this magical tea elixir that was kombucha, but it wasn't called kombucha at the time. And he drank it and he was healed, and he hailed this drink kombucha, kombu being the doctor's name and cha being the Japanese word for tea. So that's, according to myth and legend, how kombucha got its name. Now, by this point, kombucha had sort of worked its way all across Asia, but it wasn't until sort of the early 1800s that kombucha was brought to parts of Eastern Europe, so Russia and Poland. It was said it was brought originally by Polish workers that were working in Mongolia. And around the Silk Road, they took this magical tea elixir, just this kombucha brew, their inherited scobies, and they brought it back home to Poland. And then it sort of proliferated throughout Eastern Europe. So kombucha consumption and brewing was actually very popular in parts of Eastern Europe, primarily Poland, the Czech Republic, Georgia, Russia, until the late 1980s, actually, when the Soviet Union collapsed. And kombucha was really cheap to brew at home. All you needed was tea, water, sugar, and a SCOBY, which you can inherit from a friend or family member. And it was sort of this cheap soft drink that people would drink every day. They'd share with their family, made them feel good, it kept them energized. And it was sort of this folk remedy. And I've taught a couple hundred kombucha workshops now over the past 4 years around the UK. And every now and then we have somebody generally from Poland or Russia, that says, my mother used to make this when I was a kid. And one woman even said, my grandmother used to brew this under the kitchen sink because she was scared that the kids would see it and freak out. And, this is sort of what it ends up looking like. This gelatinous thing, we'll get into that in a bit. But imagine being a kid, seeing that and having to drink it from your grandmother. But she said her and her siblings started drinking kombucha from the age of 2. So it was this thing that was sort of imbued into the culture. And it was a very big part of family life in some circles. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, the market was flooded with soft drinks, Western soft drinks. So people were like, why would I drink or brew kombucha when I can drink Coca-Cola? So everyone forgot this art of making kombucha and just started drinking Western soft drinks. And actually, more recently, in the past few years, we've had messages from a lot of breweries in parts of Eastern Europe that are reigniting this tradition, many of them saying, my grandparents used to make this, and I have inherited this culture that was passed down from my grandparents to my mother to me. And so there's this amazing tradition. But eventually kombucha worked its way into parts of Central Europe and Western Europe, where it was popular around the early 1900s in Germany, where it was being studied as an anti-cancer treatment by German physicians. It became popular in Italy in the 1930s. It became popular in Switzerland in the 1960s. But it was all in these small, like either aristocratic circles or health circles or scientific circles. And it was sort of this thing that not really anybody knew about. And it wasn't until the late 1990s that kombucha, in a commercial sense, was actually brewed and sold. And it's all thanks to a guy named G.T. Dave, who's from Los Angeles. And his mother started brewing kombucha when he was young in the 1980s and the 1990s. And she had inherited her first SCOBY from a Buddhist nun that she met while traveling through India. This is a true story. It sounds crazy, but he inherited his mother's SCOBY then. He started brewing. And then he started selling kombucha, and he found that people loved it, and they said it made them feel good, and that they were drinking it in place of alcohol or Coca-Cola, and it stopped their soda addiction and all these things. So after the success of his business, other brands started popping up in California, all across the U.S., eventually in parts of Australia and New Zealand, and then it made its way to Europe. And now you can find kombucha breweries on basically every continent on Earth, apart from Antarctica, but I'm sure that will happen at some point. And now kombucha is like a $2.5 billion industry worldwide, and there are hundreds, maybe even thousands of kombucha breweries in most major cities around the world. It's pretty incredible. The community is flourishing, and the industry is growing. So that's sort of the story of how kombucha came from ancient China to Western culture. Now I want to talk a bit about sort of the process of kombucha and the science behind it. So classically brewed kombucha is made with only 4 simple ingredients. The first one is tea, and this is what I'm going to brew with tonight. It's called guayusa, and since we're on the Leaf Envy Instagram, I'll tell you a bit about guayusa. It's this incredible Amazonian holly tree that contains caffeine and small amounts of theobromine, and it's a really clean, sort of caffeinated buzz, sort of like green tea, but even better. And it tastes amazing. It has no tannins. So guayusa, this is from my friends, the Guayusa Company, and they import directly from Ecuador. It's really amazing stuff. It makes incredible kombucha. So tea is the first component of the kombucha. You then have the sugar, and tonight we're going to use an organic cane sugar, about 50 grams for a liter. And then we've got water. I've got my cold water here, which is filtered, of course, and I've got some boiling water in here. So water is a very important part of the process. You want to use filtered water or bottled spring water. You don't want to use London tap water because it can contain fluoride and chloride and different things that are just going to affect the flavor negatively. And then the most important part is the SCOBY. The SCOBY, as I mentioned, is the acronym for a symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast. And it looks a bit like this. Very funky looking. It's a pancake looking thing, slimy, funky, and you can get one of these online. This one is purchased from a company called happykombucha.co.uk, and they've been selling SCOBYs, organically produced SCOBYs, from, I believe they're based in Brighton, for like 6 years, maybe 7 years. They've been around since before we started JAR in 2015, and that's where we actually got our first culture from. So that's what I'm going to use to brew tonight. So basically, these 4 ingredients are brewed together, and they're left to ferment in a glass jar, which I have here, for anywhere between 7 days to 3 weeks. And this eventually leaves you with a very low sugar, quite sour tasting drink, which is really good for you. So what happens during that process, and I'll try and simplify the science behind it, But just like any kind of fermentation, there's yeast involved and there's sugar. So what happens is you steep your tea for a period of time, then you add your sugar, which is, in this case, the food or the fuel, as we call it, for the yeast. So remember the SCOBY. The yeast in that SCOBY basically consumes the sucrose, which is the sugar, and it converts it into two sort of naturally occurring sugars, which are fructose and glucose. Then in this symbiotic relationship, the bacteria from the SCOBY jumps in, converts that fructose into acetic acid, which is basically vinegar, and then it converts that glucose into gluconic acid. Now, gluconic acid is something that's found in apples and grapes, and it's sort of what gives, say, cider or wine that sort of that tartness, that sour, sort of appley, fruity flavor. And it's a really delicious form of acidity. So these two are created by the relationship between the sugar and the bacteria in yeast. And then also your SCOBY feeds off some of the nutrients found in the tea itself. So it will eat some of the minerals. It will also consume the caffeine. So if you don't drink much caffeine, don't worry, because after you fermented your kombucha, you're actually only left with about a third of the amount of caffeine for what you're brewing with. And today we're going to brew with 4 grams of tea, which is only 2 tea bags. It's really not very much, and it won't leave you with a super strong caffeinated brew. If you do want that caffeine hit, if you want to have your kombucha as an energy drink or something like that, you can use double that amount. It's no problem. So that's sort of the science behind the fermentation. Now let's just touch briefly on why kombucha is good for you. You know, I mentioned the fact that kombucha is brewed with tea, and tea is one of the most widely studied, one of the most ancient beverages on earth. It's regarded as potentially the healthiest drink on earth other than water. And tea contains all types of things, minerals, vitamins, and it's just really good for your body, antioxidants as well, particularly if you're brewing with a green tea, a black tea, an oolong tea, a white tea. Now, when you're fermenting kombucha, you generally want to use what I would call an unflavored tea. So there's no fruit or oils or any flavoring put in it. And also it contains caffeine of some kind. You can brew with non-caffeinated tea, but initially you want to kickstart your SCOBY with caffeine because that's an integral part of the fermentation process. So tea is really good for you. It's good for your body. In addition to that, when the acetic acid is produced, and this is what kombucha is famous for, it's very sour, very vinegary. It certainly puts people off sometimes when they have it for the first time, but like we always say, have the second sip. Don't give up on it after the first one. And when I first had kombucha, I was like, whoa, I couldn't make sense of it. So give it a shot. And I promise you, if you stick with it, eventually you will love the taste. It's crazy how your palate starts to shift. But the acetic acid is this really amazing compound. Acetic acid is what's in apple cider vinegar, and it's one of the reasons why people take shots of apple cider vinegar in the morning. It has many functions. One of them is that it helps alkalize your digestive tract, so it brings it into the correct pH balance. It also has the ability to kill bad bacteria like Salmonella and E. coli, and even bad yeast like Candida, and promote the growth of good bacteria and yeast, which exists already in your microbiome. So in a sense, it's sort of a prebiotic, you could say, rather than a probiotic. It also has the ability to help you regulate your blood sugar after you've had a heavy carbohydrate meal. So say you have a whole pizza to yourself and you get that kind of slump. If you have a kombucha after that, your energy levels will actually be a bit better because it helps regulate the release of insulin into your bloodstream. So acetic acid is this really incredible compound. You'll even find it in things like some cleaning products. If you have an ear infection, acetic acid will be in the solution because it can help kill the bad stuff. But in a drink, it's just incredibly good for your body, kickstarting your digestion, helping promote the growth of all that good bacteria. And it's sort of this magical compound that nobody really talks about. So in addition to that, you get the antioxidants from the tea when you ferment kombucha. But what's amazing is that when you ferment tea, what happens is the cell walls of the tea leaf break down, which make the antioxidants inside more bioavailable. Your body has more access to using them and utilizing the nutrients in them. So you actually get more of the antioxidants than if you had a standard cup of tea. And that happens during that, 1 week to 3 week fermentation process. So kombucha is really good for you for a variety of reasons. In addition to being a low sugar drink, generally it's below 4 or 5 grams of sugar per 100 mils. Now, the thing that a lot of people believe kombucha is good for you for is the probiotic element, because kombucha is brewed with bacteria and yeast. It has living bacteria and yeast in it. But at the moment, there's no scientific research that can support the idea that the bacteria found in kombucha actually have any noticeable impact on your gut health. So what we like to focus on are the scientifically proven benefits of kombucha, which are from the acetic acid, from the antioxidants. So that's sort of a little background on why kombucha is actually good for you. Now what I'm going to do is a quick brew. I'm going to do it using this jar here. So what I recommend you guys do is, I assume many of you don't have the ingredients at your disposal right now. So we're going to save this on the Leaf NV grid so you can go back to it and follow these steps and make your own at home. And what I recommend is you go to our Instagram page at Jar Kombucha. And in our saved stories, we actually have a recipe. It's the same recipe that we still use to this day, and it's a recipe I'm going to use right now. So you can reference that, you can screenshot it, and you can buy the ingredients from happykombucha.co.uk. And we're not affiliated with them. They just have a really good selection of stuff. And then you can use whatever tea that you want. I mentioned it's best to use an unflavored tea, a green tea, a white tea, oolong, a black tea, or in my case, a guayusa. You can even use yerba mate or something like that. A great place to find really high quality teas is a tea shop in Camden. They also have a website. It's called Mayleaf, M-E-I Leaf. An incredible selection of super high quality teas sourced from around the world. So check them out. It's a great place to start. So initially, what we need to do is we need to put in the boiling water. Now, because I'm going to be using guayusa, guayusa needs to be steeped at about 100 degrees, so boiling. You can see all the steam pouring out. Different teas require different steep times and temperatures. So whatever tea that you're using, you just want to do some research first to make sure that you're not steeping it at too hot of a temperature. Because if you do that, say with something like a delicate green tea, you might burn the leaves, which will release too many tannins. It will be bitter. It just won't taste very good. So we want to make sure that we're steeping at the right temperature. In this case, using a guayusa, 100 degrees, totally safe. You can't really get much hotter than that. So this is a 1 liter glass jar. I'm going to fill this up a quarter of the way, roughly speaking. You never want to fill your entire jar up and then steep your tea. You want to only use a quarter. So what we're doing is essentially creating like a tea concentrate. And then we're going to top that up with cold water, which is really important because if the water is too hot when you introduce your SCOBY, it's basically going to kill all the bacteria and yeast in the SCOBY. So you want to make sure that the water is cool enough, roughly below 40 degrees, so that the bacteria and yeast thrive during the fermentation process. So normally I recommend about 5 to 10 minutes of steep time. It's entirely up to you. The longer you steep your tea, the more sort of flavor or strength you're going to get from it. I like sort of a light kombucha brew. You don't need too much of it. Most of the nutrients and the caffeine and the minerals are actually extracted within the first 30 seconds. So I'm just going to do basically this for a few more seconds so I don't waste your time with waiting 5 minutes for this to steep. But you can already see the water getting a little bit of color, and that's what you want to see. You want it to get dark. And so I'm just going to take them out here, put them on my plate. And you can use loose leaf tea as well. One way of doing that is just pouring the loose leaf tea directly in the water and then pouring it into a sieve, into another jar, and then pouring it back in. So that's a way of doing it without having to buy tea bags, because some of the best quality tea, arguably definitely the best quality tea, doesn't come in tea bags. It's often in a loose form. So we've got our tea here. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add my sugar. As I mentioned, this is organic cane sugar, and this is 50 grams per liter. Now, it's important to note that about half of this sugar is going to be consumed during the fermentation process. And the residual sugar that will be left is actually going to be mainly glucose. And glucose is great because it's the most readily available source of energy for the human body. And that's one of the reasons why kombucha is really good for activities. If you have it before you work out, or you have it post-workout, or even in between workouts, it's really good for recovery. It's really good for energy. It's similar to taking those glucose tablets or that gel, when people are running marathons. Kombucha contains the same thing, glucose. So it actually converts into energy very rapidly. So this sugar is very important. And as I mentioned earlier, it's the food or the fuel for the fermentation process, for the yeast in particular. So I'm just going to pour that in. Pour that whole thing in there. And then I've got my spoon here, and I'm just going to stir this until the sugar is dissolved. Let's see, that should be good. Now, that looked like a lot of sugar, but actually, if you think about it, it's about half the amount of sugar that's in a Coca-Cola, which is crazy. If you think about how much sugar is in a standard soft drink, it's just insane. There's no reason to use that much. And remember, you're going to be left with so much less. So we've got our tea, we've got our sugar dissolved in there. Now this is the very important part. I'm pouring in my cold filtered water, and I'm going to pour it to about halfway initially. And again, as I mentioned, this is really important for cooling that water down. And if you don't have a temperature at home, or temperature thermometer at home, a good way of being able to judge whether it's too hot is it too hot to hold? But if you do have a thermometer at home, it's good to check the temperature to make sure it's sub 40 degrees. So we've got this here. It's topped up with the cold water. And so now it's cool enough and safe enough to pour in our SCOBY. Now I'm going to try and do this without spilling this thing all over the place. And this is it here. And you'll see that this SCOBY is like a gelatin looking thing. And I'm just going to plop that right in. There we go. And then with the SCOBY is this liquid. This is the starter liquid. This is basically all the bacteria and yeast suspended in a liquid form. And if you follow our recipe, which is saved on our Jar Kombucha Instagram stories, you'll see that you can use just this instead if you want. You don't actually need the cellulose, but it's a good place to start. So I'm going to pour this starter liquid in with it. It has a little bit of gloopy bits. It's definitely not the prettiest looking thing, but it's very important for the fermentation process. I'm going to top it up with a little bit more water. And then stir it a little bit, just to make sure we have distributed the bacteria and yeast and the sugar. Ooh, I got a gloopy bit. You can't be too precious with this stuff. And if you live in a shared house, your housemates might wonder what you're doing, because it's pretty freaky looking. It looks like a science experiment gone wrong. But this is it. This is your finished kombucha. And you've got everything in here. And what I actually forgot to bring with me was a cloth. So this is very important. Tastes good. What you're going to need next is like a towel, like a dish towel. And you can just put that on top with a rubber band so that it blocks anything from falling into it. And it keeps a little bit of airflow into the brew. And then you want to set this aside, maybe close to your radiator, ideally somewhere that's sort of clean, and you don't want it to be near any smoke or anything like that, because that can really damage the integrity of the fermentation. So in your kitchen is actually a really good idea, and it's starting to get a little bit warmer, so that's good. If you do want to get really specific with your brewing, kombucha ferments best at 24 degrees, roughly. Anywhere between 21 and 25 degrees is ideal. And you can get heating pads and stuff like that. So if you really want to nerd out and make this like a something you're doing regularly, you can get more specific with that. But generally speaking, as long as it's above like 15 to 16 degrees, it's going to continue fermenting. So put this in your kitchen with a dish towel on top, and then you're going to let it sit for roughly 5 days. And what I recommend you do is just keep an eye on it. And what you're going to see is that after 3 or 4 days, a layer is going to form on top. And essentially that layer is the same thing that you have in here. It's the cellulose version of the SCOBY, and it's a really good sign that your kombucha is fermenting. but you don't actually need it. So after about 5 days, I'd recommend you take that layer off and you either chuck it in the bin, or if you want to save it for some reason, you can do that. And then at that point, you start stirring your kombucha every day. And this is important because you want to get oxygen into your kombucha. The bacteria in kombucha thrive in a highly oxygen-rich environment. So the more you stir it, the more oxygen you get in there, the better it's going to ferment, the better it's going to taste. And there's more details in our actual recipe, which you can find again on the Jar Kombucha Instagram in the Save Stories. And if you have any questions about the brewing process, you can message me directly on the Jar Instagram. I run it, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. And there's some details in there as well on flavoring, which is a great part about kombucha. You don't have to just ferment it with tea and that's it. After you've fermented it, you can add fruit juice, you can add herbs, you can add spices, you can do loads of different stuff. My personal favorite is a ginger kombucha. Ginger works so well with the acidity of kombucha. It brings out this really nice, subtle floral sweetness. And I recommend using a Peruvian ginger root and juicing it yourself if you can. But you can also, a really good way of doing it is actually buying, those Moju booster shots. Those work really well for flavoring kombucha. So send me a message once you get to that stage, and I can send you some links to how to carbonate your kombucha, how to flavor it, some really interesting recipes. So yeah, I hope this was helpful. I'm just going to look through the questions here to see if there's anything. You know what I recommend is I don't want to go over here. So if you just send me a message, if you have any brewing related questions or any questions about what I talked about tonight, and I'll get back to you. But good luck brewing. Thank you so much for tuning in, everyone. And yeah, hope to see you soon. Cheers. Thank you to Leaf Envy as well for having me.